To understand the unease that settled deep within the German High Command whenever his name appeared in intercepted communications or intelligence briefings, one must begin not with the man himself, but with the way modern war had transformed the relationship between speed, uncertainty, and command. By the time American armored columns began pushing across Europe, German generals were no longer fighting a war of clear fronts and deliberate campaigns, they were fighting entropy itself, a collapsing system where every unexpected movement threatened to unravel carefully rationed resources, fragile supply lines, and already strained morale. In that environment, predictability was survival. And what terrified them most was an enemy commander who seemed to reject predictability as a principle. German officers were trained in a tradition that prized methodical planning, hierarchical clarity, and doctrinal coherence. Even blitzkrieg, often mischaracterized as reckless speed, was in fact rooted in rigorous staff work and detailed operational theory. It depended on tempo, yes, but a tempo that could be calculated, anticipated, and countered by an opponent who understood its logic. What they encountered instead was a commander whose actions often appeared to violate not just German expectations, but the broader assumptions of 20th-century warfare. He did not merely move quickly, he moved irregularly, exploiting gaps that intelligence models said should not exist, and advancing when German commanders believed any rational enemy would pause. This dissonance was not abstract. It translated directly into sleepless nights and increasingly frantic reports. German generals feared him because he compressed time in ways their systems could not absorb. Industrial war had taught them to think in terms of schedules, fuel deliveries, rail timetables, replacement cycles, repair depots, and communication delays. Their entire command structure was built around the idea that there was always a measurable interval between an enemy's decision and its consequences. Against this opponent, that interval seemed to vanish. Orders were issued, and before countermeasures could be organized, the situation had already changed. Part of the fear stemmed from reputation, but reputation alone does not paralyze seasoned commanders. What mattered was the consistency with which his forces appeared where they were least expected, often with logistical support that German analysts believed impossible. The German army, constrained by fuel shortages and damaged infrastructure, projected its own limitations onto the enemy. They assumed that armored formations must pause to refuel, that supply columns would lag behind spearheads, that exhaustion would impose natural brakes on momentum. Again and again, those assumptions proved wrong. Each violation eroded confidence not just in specific plans, but in the analytical frameworks German generals relied upon to make sense of the war. There was also the psychological weight of asymmetry. German commanders were accustomed to being the ones who dictated tempo, who forced adversaries to react. Now they found themselves responding, improvising, and retreating under pressure that never fully abated. Reports describe a growing sense that this American general did not fight the German army as a static opponent, but as a living organism to be kept off balance, denied rest, and forced into continuous motion. This was not merely operational brilliance, it was an intuitive grasp of how industrial armies break down when their internal rhythms are disrupted. German fear was sharpened by intelligence failures that seemed almost personal. Time and again, their assessments underestimated how far his units could advance in a single day. Maps were marked with projected front lines that were obsolete before the ink dried. When commanders asked how such advances were possible, the answers were deeply unsettling. The enemy commander encouraged initiative at lower levels, tolerated calculated risk, and fostered a culture where hesitation was seen as more dangerous than boldness. For an army increasingly bound by rigid directives from above, this flexibility felt like chaos weaponized. This fear was not limited to the battlefield. It extended into the realm of symbols and morale. German generals understood that war in the industrial age was fought as much in factories, rail yards, and public perception as on the front lines. An enemy commander who embodied relentless forward motion threatened not only territory but narrative. Each rapid advance fed Allied propaganda, reinforced the image of inevitable defeat, and undermined efforts to maintain discipline among troops already weary from years of attrition. The idea that this commander might appear anywhere along the front at any time amplified that effect. He became a spectre as much as a strategist. Crucially, German fear did not arise from a belief that he was reckless. On the contrary, what unsettled them was the sense that his apparent audacity was underwritten by a deep understanding of modern logistics. He grasped that industrial war was ultimately about throughput, how many vehicles could move, how quickly fuel could be delivered, how efficiently repair units could operate under pressure. While German systems were collapsing under bombing and material shortages, his forces seemed to grow stronger the faster they moved, feeding on captured resources and momentum itself. This inversion of expectations was deeply destabilizing. There was also an uncomfortable recognition that he understood German habits better than many of their own commanders did. His advances often targeted the seams between units, the transitional zones where responsibility was ambiguous and response times were slow. German generals had been trained to value clear lines of authority and defined sectors. When those lines were penetrated, confusion spread rapidly upward. Orders conflicted, reinforcements arrived too late or in the wrong place, and local commanders hesitated, unsure who held authority. Facing an opponent who consistently exploited these vulnerabilities forced German leaders to confront the fragility of their own command culture. The fear was compounded by comparison. Other Allied commanders were respected, even admired, but they were seen as operating within a familiar strategic grammar. Their advances could be anticipated, their pauses predicted, their priorities inferred. Against this particular commander, inference itself became unreliable. German generals could not be certain whether a feint was a feint, whether a pause signaled exhaustion or preparation, whether a narrow thrust masked a broader encirclement. This uncertainty forced them into defensive postures that consumed resources and accelerated collapse. As the war progressed, this fear became institutionalized. Orders circulated warning of rapid breakthroughs, advising units to prepare for sudden appearances of enemy armor far beyond expected lines. The name itself became shorthand for danger, a signal that normal assumptions no longer applied. Younger officers absorbed this anxiety, learning to associate his presence with operational disaster. Fear cascaded downward, affecting decision-making at every level. In industrial war, where coordination is paramount, such psychological fractures can be as lethal as physical destruction. At the climax of this dynamic was the realization that resistance itself was becoming counterproductive. German generals faced a dilemma: commit scarce reserves to halt advances that might already be outdated, or conserve forces and risk catastrophic penetration elsewhere. Either choice carried severe consequences. The enemy commander's ability to force these dilemmas repeatedly, often simultaneously, magnified his impact beyond the actual size of his forces. He turned limited material superiority into overwhelming psychological pressure. Resolution came not in the form of a single decisive battle, but in a gradual erosion of confidence. German generals began to think defensively even when opportunities for counterattack existed. They delayed, debated, and deferred decisions, haunted by the possibility that any pause would be exploited immediately. In the end, their fear reflected a deeper truth about modern war, that power lies not only in numbers or technology, but in the capacity to disrupt an opponent's understanding of time itself. The commander they feared most was the one who made the future arrive faster than they could comprehend, leaving their carefully constructed systems obsolete in the very moment they were deployed.